Welcome to Anita Goodesign Fundamentals. I'm Bryan, and today we're going to be going over how to do the technique of trapunto on a quilt block. Now, before we get into that, just to let you know about our fundamentals, this is where we've taken all of our major techniques and made them easy for you to learn so that after you get through doing our new fundamentals, you'll be able to go through any of our designs with confidence and navigate them properly. So today we're going to learn not only how to do the base of a quilt block, but also how to do the added look of trapunto on top. The first thing we're going to do is refer to the materials list for this project. We mentioned curved tip applique scissors. These are very handy for trimming in intricate cuts, which you'll see why we like using these in a moment. But of course, everyone has their preference. However, if you're new, the recommendations I'm giving will make things easier for you. All right, so beginning, we've gone ahead and loaded our design onto the machine. I've gone ahead and used a darker thread, so it'll show some contrast on what you'll be seeing happen on the machine. So I'm going to go ahead and put this on there and get it started. Now, when referring to the actual tutorial book, I know that a lot of people, when they're first beginning or starting out, tend to like to only look at the pictures, but we want to make sure that you're using the number steps as well. Always get familiar with the number steps first and use the pictures as a visual aid. So beginning with the number steps, we're going to begin with the squaring stitch. Now that we've run our squaring stitch, which you can see here, that I've done on a contrasting thread to show up a little bit better, we're going to move to the second step, which will be placing our batting. So we have our batting. When we cover the squaring stitch, I'm going to use just the corner of it and make sure that it is completely covered on all sides. And then I'll follow up by using a little bit of tape to hold down those corners. Once we have our first layer of batting down, we're going to run the tacking stitch. Now, when you run this tacking stitch, you'll notice in the number steps that there is a bunch of directions in one step before you begin step 3, which is going to be tacking this down and then putting down 2 additional layers of batting. Now we'll run the tacking stitch for the batting. Now that we've run the tacking stitch for the batting, we can go ahead and remove our tape and trim the first layer of batting. When trimming this first layer, it will be important to get as close as you can. And using these curved tips, you can see how I'm holding the actual batting taut as I trimmed. Helps get a cleaner cut all the way to the edge so that your batting is not sticking out past the original squaring stitch. If it does, that will put your batting in the seam allowance, which will make it harder to sew together later on. Once we have it trimmed all the way around, as you see here, we can continue following our directions and place the additional 2 layers of batting and completely once again, cover the entire squaring stitch. Once that's done, you can tape like we did the first time and begin step 3. Now that we've taped our 2 additional layers of batting down, we'll proceed with step 3, which will be tacking down the batting for the trapunto. Now that we've finished step 3, you'll notice that there are further directions after the tacking stitch, which is to trim only the 2 layers of batting we just tacked down, and then we're going to place our base fabric. Now that we've completely trimmed the second 2 layers of batting all the way around, you can see how this gives us the base for our trapunto. So now that we have a base layer of batting and then 2 additional layers appliqued on top, we're ready to place our base fabric. Same thing when placing our base fabric, we'll completely cover the entire squaring stitch, but making sure we have at least a 1/2 inch of fabric all the way around the entire design. Now that we have the base fabric in place, we'll go ahead and run step 4, which will tack it down. Now that the tack down stitch for the base fabric is ran, we'll begin the next step, which will be the stippling. We recommend that you coordinate the stippling stitch thread color with the color of your base fabric so that they blend in tonally. Now that we've run our stippling step, I'm going to turn the hoop a little bit to show you how the stippling has pressed down around the additional 2 layers of batting, creating a lofted look to the trapunto. Now that we're ready for the final step, we're going to run the bean stitch that will go around the actual trapunto and a little bit on it. This you can either run tonally if you like. In this instance, we're going to run it in a contrasting thread. That way you can highlight it even more. It's an aesthetic approach that you can choose based on the design you're going for. Now that you've finished running your final step, which was the bean stitch, your design is complete. And as you can see here, we're completely done with all of the embroidery steps. And now we're going to follow the picture steps in your tutorial so they can show you how to properly take it out of your hoop and trim it so that there's a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around the squaring stitch. Once you've done trimming it, you have completed your Trapunto quilt block. Now that we've finished our quilt block and completely trimmed it, leaving a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around our squaring stitch, we have our beautiful Trapunto quilt block with the tonal stippling and bean stitches to highlight out all that lofted up batting that's underneath the base fabric, and you've completed your first Trapunto quilt block. Congratulations, and I hope you now feel more empowered to do many more of these so that you can become a Trapunto expert.